My questions I often ask educators as we're considering about this idea of prioritizing is, are all of these standards in the 3 grade spans of elementary, middle, and high, are all of them essential? That means absolutely critical for students to acquire in order to be ready for the next level of learning, the next grade level, the next course. So that's one thing to consider. Are all of these standards equal? One other question I ask educators to consider is whether or not the school year is long enough for them to adequately, emphasis on adequately, teach, assess, reteach, and reassess their students on all of the standards. Most people will say no, there isn't, which is again a reason to thoughtfully get together as a professional learning community and decide and determine which of these standards should receive the greatest emphasis. I want to give a definition of priority standards: a carefully selected subset of the total list of the grade-specific, the course-specific standards within each content area that students must know and be able to do by the end of the school year so that they are prepared to enter the next grade or the next course. What about the other standards? What do we call them? How do we deal with them? How do we address those? I've named those other standards supporting standards, and here's a definition of those. The supporting standards are those standards that support, connect to, or enhance the priority standards. And they're taught within the context of the priorities, but here's the key distinguishing feature between the two. They do not receive the same degree of instruction and assessment emphasis as do the priority standards. So at this point of the process, people want to know, well, okay, we understand why we need to be doing this. We understand what the priority standards are. We understand what the supporting standards are and how the two go together. But how do you actually select these priorities? Well, obviously we need a set of criteria, and they look like this. Readiness for the next level of learning. We've talked a lot about that already. Which standards will really prepare students for the next grade, the next course? The second one, endurance. Which standards represent concepts and skills that are going to last over time? Think of that as life skills, life concepts. The third one is leverage. We're talking about literacy across the disciplines, shared responsibility. Which standards, for example, if a student could read a table, chart, and graph in mathematics, could a student then transfer or leverage that over to read a table, chart, and graph in social studies, visual performing arts, any other content area? So we're looking so far at readiness, endurance, leverage, as lenses, so to speak, through which to find which standards meet these criteria. Those then would be what we call the priorities. The other one that people want to talk about all the time is what's going to be emphasized on the state test. Educators start looking through these circles as they review the standards, study the standards, to start making those selections of which ones should be priorities. So now usually what people say at this point, well, they want to know, well, how do we prioritize them? You've talked about criteria. How do we actually go into this process of assembling our teams together and determining that subset of the total? Here are the steps that educators will then go through. They'll make their initial selections using the criteria that they're presented at the time of the seminar or the workshop. Then they'll also look for connections to state tests, reach consensus, and then chart those selections by each grade level. So there'll be the chart for kindergarten, first grade, second grade, and so on. These charts are then placed on the wall, and we have a discussion, which is the most powerful part of this entire process. Educators present will then discuss the vertical alignment, kindergarten through 12th grade. If kids finish and have these standards well in hand by the end of kindergarten, will they be prepared for first grade? If they finish by first grade, will they be prepared for second grade, all the way up through high school, with the goal then is that by the time students leave high school, they will be prepared to achieve college and career readiness. After years of conducting this process with groups all over the United States, I can honestly say that the most powerful step is step 4, the vertical alignment of the standards. Because people can talk up and down the grades about where are these standards? Are we sure that students are going to have them well in hand before they move to the next level of learning? And then lastly, we talk about not making it an isolated process where only a few people do it, but getting the feedback from colleagues, other administrators, and then combining that feedback into a final published document so that we actually end up with a shared ownership document that has had the input of all. To wrap up this overview of how to prioritize the standards, I'd like to show you this important message that I've found over the years is absolutely critical to communicate to all members of the school system, and it's this: prioritization, not elimination. What that means is we need to constantly remind one another that we are not cutting standards. We are simply prioritizing to determine which ones are the most complex, which ones are the most comprehensive, which ones deserve the greatest emphasis, both in instruction and assessment, to move students forward to the next level of learning with those prior standards well in hand.